morning. This is Anna Patterson with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Samuel Gunter.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all enjoying the turn to a little bit warmer weather, at least for now. I'm on in part because Stephanie's feeling a bit under the weather. But regardless, I probably would have been on because we're going to structure this call a little bit differently than we normally do. And that is in large part to, and I'm not going to mince words, the existential threat facing affordable housing and community development programs nationwide. We are in an incredibly perilous moment, and there is a lot of significant news to talk through. And there's also a lot of, I'm not going to call it insignificant news, but because of the volume and complexity of some of this stuff, we are not going to get to everything that is in the news. As always, there will be call notes, and you can wade through some of the other things that are happening around the state. There's some interesting land use decisions and so on that are in the news right now in North Carolina that are very worth checking out. But given sort of the big news at the federal level, we gotta start there and spend the bulk of our time there. Usually we'll just kind of run down the updates on the news from federal to state and so on. I want to start us off by talking about threats and possible interventions. And so there's kind of three buckets that I think all of us need to be focusing on right now. There's administrative threats, there are the legislative, and then we have the public facing. And as we think about what we do, how we respond, I need each of us in our organizations to be thinking about how our actions are addressing each of these three kind of loci of power, right? So on the administrative front, on the legislative front, and public facing. So now we're going to take a step back. I'm going to start with disaster recovery because there's some significant movements on this front, but it's all going to roll up into the federal stuff that we're going to get to here in just a second. So one of the things that you'll find in our call notes this week is we have released the public CDBG Disaster Recovery Action Plan for Helene. For those of you in the West, for those of you who touch disaster recovery in the state, this is time to wade through what the state's plan looks like. It's notable in that we also saw Governor Stein this week requesting an additional $19 billion in disaster recovery funds for North Carolina. So there's an administrative, to think again about these administrative, legislative, and public-facing categories. We have the administrative side, which is the CDBG Disaster Recovery Action Plan. And for those of us that are in the weeds, this is the place to provide feedback and the time to provide feedback on what the articulated plan is for disaster recovery funds in Western North Carolina. If this is you, your community, your organization, this is a plan that you need to be wading through to get a sense of where the gaps are, where are the blind spots in the governor's plan for the bulk of federal disaster recovery funds. On the legislative front, and we knew this as soon as we got our disaster recovery award from the feds, or notice of it, that it was insufficient, right? And you've often heard me say, or if you haven't, welcome to the first time hearing me say it, because we talk about it in housing counseling all the time. There's no way to financially educate yourself out of not enough, right? You can't perfectly administer your way out of vastly insufficient funds to meet the task, right? And that's what we're facing as we look ahead to a decade of Helene recovery. There are administrative challenges to work through. What is the strategy? Where are we putting resources? Are we deploying them correctly? And all of that absolutely needs work. But if we are dealing with fundamentally insufficient resources to the need, then all of this work on the administrative side isn't going to solve our problem. So there's work to be done on the disaster recovery front on the administrative side, helping the governor craft the action plan to meet the need and to make sure we're not missing any blind spots. And then again, on the insufficient funds for the task at hand. So, as I said, Governor Stein has requested an additional $19 billion. But as we look at the news over the last week in the housing world, there are two big headlines that we have to address. And first is the proposed 50% cut to HUD staff. Catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, and potentially illegal, which we're seeing with a number of decisions coming out of this administration. But I want to be very clear, and for those of you that have heard me give legislative updates for the last decade here at the Coalition, I don't know that I've ever said anything as forcefully as this current administration has housing and community development programs in their crosshairs. It's a direct assault on the work that we do and the impact that our organizations have in communities across the state. Gutting HUD staff by half, and from what we are seeing in other documents, the CPD staff, which is the bulk of the community development program. So if you do home, if you do CDBG, if you do disaster recovery, that staff is proposed to be cut 84%, the bulk of the CPD staff. It's devastating. So there is administrative pushback to be had, and there is legislative pushback to be had. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Because the other thing out there with the HUD cuts and the federal budget is we have March 14th deadline for federal funding, where we need to pass a continuing resolution. They're still working on top-line numbers. You saw some of the moves over the end of the last week and over the weekend by the Senate to try and get a budget framework in place. Again, you can read more detail about that. What the Coalition has done over the last couple of weeks, and thank you again to those of you who signed on to our letter to Congress asking our delegation to make sure that already appropriated housing investments get to where they're going and aren't held up by this administration, and to prioritize those investments in any kind of budget negotiations. For those of you who have not heard, we're up over 400 signatories on that letter and covering all 100 North Carolina counties, which I think is a testament to the breadth of the impact of these programs, and I think the threat that all of us are facing, the significance of that threat. That letter has gone out to our congressional delegation, and we are following back up with our Congress folks about how they are supporting North Carolina communities and making sure that these resources get to where they need to go. So in terms of what do we do, it feels like a very helpless feeling for a lot of folks who this is their mission. This is what they do for a living. This is this is our vocation, to be a part of making our communities affordable and just places to live, cutting off the major source of resources that allow a lot of these programs, a lot of these interventions to happen, to transform communities all across the state. It feels like a very helpless time watching what's playing out in Washington, D.C. right now. Pushback is working. I think a lot of folks in Congress right now are feeling the confusion and fear from a number of folks. That still needs to be communicated. The catastrophic impact of what is being proposed absolutely still needs to be communicated to Congress people, right? So there's a legislative strategy there. The other piece that I think we often neglect as housing practitioners, as housing advocates, is the public-facing side. And I think any of us could run down the types of programs that we run, the folks that we partner with. We're always trying to communicate about the work that we do and build support for the work that we do, right? But I think what is often a gap is being explicit about the public resources that are deployed to make much of the work that we do possible. And so for a large portion of the public, even folks who are highly invested in our organizations, in our programs, are unclear about what public resources go to making these programs work. And that's a missing piece that I think we need to be tending to in the coming weeks and months, because the pressure coming from practitioners is a lot and is getting through. Those messages are getting through, but the folks in our communities who benefit from these programs and the folks who support the organizations that do this work need to understand what the threat is to the loss of these resources. Those are on the legislative side and on the public-facing side. Those are two critical things that our organizations need to be doing right now. One of the other big pieces of news that I want to talk about, and again, this is a very atypical housing call, but there is so much that is fundamentally at stake at the moment that is moving and moving quickly. So there was the other thing to report, excuse me, is that on Friday, February 21st, a federal court granted a preliminary injunction blocking the administration from terminating or changing federal contracts that they consider equity related. So this is a preliminary injunction on the very first executive order that was issued by the Trump administration. This is the DEI executive order. And they're at issue in this court case were three things in particular from that executive order. One, the requirement that these federal contractors, federal agencies, and the folks that receive their funds self-certify that they are both in compliance with the executive order and that they run no programs that are DEI or DEI related. So self-certify, or have the money taken away, or be referred to prosecution under threat of perjury for that self-certification. We were one of many organizations from across the country who received some version of this for the programs that we run over the last week and a half. This demand for self-certification for an undefined thing, the communication the coalition received was not only to self-certify that we didn't run any programs that were DEI related, but also that we remove any language that had the perception of, which, again, in the executive order doesn't define any of these things, and yet they're trying to shift federal funding according to this. This is an administrative problem, clearly on its face illegal, and it's a major challenge for housing programs. Because of the undefined nature of DEI, it could be argued that much of what housing and community development programs do is related to this, especially as it is undefined. The coalition made a decision to contribute to the litigation that led to the preliminary injunction on Friday. That was a decision that was was difficult to make because our normal posture is coalition building, not litigation. But this is the moment that we are in. We've already experienced the funding freezes that have been put on hold. And we saw in this an existential threat, again, to broader housing and community development programs. To this, I want to say to this universe of organizations, of advocates, and of providers, as we move forward, I think part of the confusion that we felt getting a communication on a Friday with a required response on a Wednesday, and then a response on a Thursday that our response was insufficient and we had until noon the next day to respond, that kind of timeline, I think, puts all of us in this position of we're trying to do this work. These resources are important. We don't want to threaten those resources. This request is clearly out of the ordinary. What do we do? And in isolation, it's very difficult to make those decisions. And so as we think about the legislative strategies and continuing to push to our members of Congress the importance of these programs for their communities and their voters, and the work that we do, that it is critical for for counties across the state, that legislative strategy is important, both to push back against some of this overreach by the current administration, as well as future funding decisions. So that legislative strategy is important. That the public-facing strategy that our supporters, our partners, our clients, our residents, our partner families, our neighbors, the folks who donate to our organizations, that they understand the critical nature of the public resources and what work that enables us to do in our communities, that public-facing work is critically important. And on the administrative side, it is important that we are in constant contact with one another, right? It was incredibly helpful for us last week to communicate with others around the nation that had gotten a similar demand from a partnering federal agency, and to chart a strategy forward. If you are getting something that feels like it is out of the ordinary, I'll just say out of the ordinary, please let us know about that. We do not want to be making our decisions in isolation, because if you are facing those threats, then there are numerous organizations around the state that are facing similar threats. Again, this is an atypical call. Usually we just kind of run down the news without a lot of comment, but what we are facing at this moment is an existential crisis for housing and community development programs, not just in North Carolina, but around the country. And I would say for folks who have made this work their calling, their vocation, and who care deeply about their communities and the transformative work that these resources make possible, buckle up, y'all. We got a lot of work to do. And the work is pressing. It is timely. It is now. And it is time for us to be communicating clearly with passion and with dedication, making sure that we do not lose these investments, that we do not lose these programs, these dedicated folks that make this work possible around the state and transforming communities around the state. There is so much more that we could talk about. We are already over time. I would push you again to the call notes. There are a number of reports, events, some op-eds, dates to put on the calendar, news from around the state that we weren't able to cover because of these bigger news items that are existential threats to housing and community development programs at a federal level. So again, thinking about what our response, how do we respond in this moment that feels a little, it can make us all feel, I think, a little helpless. That the legislative strategy is still active, right? That communication to your members of Congress is still incredibly important. And thank you again to all of you who signed on to the letter that we drafted about housing and community development programs, both on the administrative side and in the budget process moving forward. That is making a difference. The public-facing communications, to overemphasize, especially now, the critical nature of the public resources to the work that you do, so that all of the people that are around your organization, that know the good work that your organization does, are starting to feel and understand the critical nature of the public resources that make that work possible. And then finally, on the administrative side, if there are communications coming from your counterparts at federal agencies, things that don't seem like they are in the normal order of business, we need to talk. We need to know so that we can come up with a collective response, because you are not the only one getting one right now. That the threats are real, the threats are existential to this field of work, and our response needs to be overwhelming and immediate. So again, as always, I want to end this call by saying thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the dedication you bring, the creativity that you bring to this work. the hours and the sweat. Thank you. If no one is telling you, thank you. I am deeply appreciative. We need your voice. We need it now more than ever. We'll see you next time.